Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our discussion of American cultural history. In the previous lecture, we talked about culture in the early colonial era and some discussion of culture among the Native American population. In this lecture, we'll talk about the culture among the slaves, both the slaves themselves and those who enslaved them in early American history. It's clearly beyond the scope of this course to thoroughly explore the origins and practice of African slavery. However, the legacy of racism and slavery permeates American culture well into the 20th century and even today. So we need to recognize some of those origins in the colonial and early American period. First, it should be said that slavery in the colonial era was diverse, and that it differed much depending on the place and changed much over time. African slaves themselves were diverse, drawn from different parts of the continent, sometimes from tribes at war with each other. While slave owners often made little distinction, we now understand that slaves may not have spoken the same languages, shared customs, or had any affinity for each other at all. They were a richly diverse population. Slavery in New England and the middle colonies, such as New York or Pennsylvania, was less prominent than in the South, but it still existed and exerted a strong cultural influence. Slaves in these areas tended to operate in close proximity to whites and in smaller numbers. Men might work in the trades as coopers, cobblers, or furniture makers, while women most often worked in the home. Within these relationships, slaves at times developed relationships with their owners, or were able to work their way to freedom, or even establish their own businesses. Other slaves worked in the shipping industry, either on the docks or on the ships themselves. In such cases as well, some African slaves traveled the world on ships, learned many languages and skills of the trade, and sometimes even bought their own freedom. Throughout the period of slavery, the slaves struggled against their captors and attempted to preserve some measure of independence and self-determination, in ways large and small. In the colonial era, before decades of racism and repression had been seared into the slaveholding community, and some flexibility remained, first-generation slaves from Africa might maintain their African culture and customs in a number of ways. Most often, slaveholders attempted to squelch African culture by renaming the slaves, forbidding the use of African language and customs, and not allowing them to be educated. And yet, when they were out of the watchful gaze of the masters and overseers, slaves were able to preserve some of their traditional cultures, or create new ones in opposition to the restrictions imposed on them. In the privacy of their own quarters, slaves might maintain their African names or speak their native languages. They also taught their children through storytelling. Slave culture and the beginning of an African American identity, rather than a simply African identity, involved a blending of African traditions with others already present in the colonies or states. New languages, such as Gullah and Geechee, combined African words with English. Slaves created musical instruments, utilizing the tools available to them in the slave quarters, and often gourds grown on the plantations. They preserved traditional recipes and cooking methods from Africa, but had to adapt to the foods and ingredients available to them. And the stories they told drew on African folk tales, but often adapted the character and settings to life in the Americas. The story of Brer Rabbit, for instance, is rooted in a traditional African folk character, the trickster, but the language and the setting are based in America. Slave agency also took the form of resistance, sometimes passive, sometimes overt. Within their roles on the plantation or the workplace, slaves might work slowly, pretend they didn't know how to do something, or break the tools. Those working in the kitchen might make bad food or even poison the master. We can only imagine how many slave owners got the spit special. More serious were attempts to either run away or rebel outright against the slave owners. In the early years of slavery in the Chesapeake, in Virginia, slave owners tended to look the other way as slaves traveled on an informal network of pathways known as the Grapevine Express, connecting plantation to plantation. Despite rules preventing slaves from marrying, owners understood that allowing them some small measure of freedom might keep them placated enough that they would not rebel. So slaves might take a few hours to travel from one plantation to another, meeting up with friends, family, or even husbands or wives. Through these relationships, they could maintain their identities and even, in some cases, start and maintain families. In these more relaxed conditions, slaves might occasionally run away temporarily. This idea of self-emancipation, freeing themselves from slavery, had a long tradition that would carry on all the way through the Civil War. We can only imagine the desire for slaves to get away, if only for a day or two. Few slaves attempted to run away permanently in the colonial era. Remember that in that period there was slavery in all the colonies, so there was no safe harbor in the North. There were fewer options for slaves who did run away. Saying that, occasionally slaves did try to run away to Florida or the West, where they might find safety in a fugitive slave community. More often, slaves would run away for a day or two and return to the plantation. While punishment for this action could be severe, depending on the slave owner, some slaves could manage these brief temporary breaks without terrible punishment. Examples like this became more rare after the Revolutionary War, for a number of reasons, not least of which was the revolutionary rhetoric and the ideals of the Revolution. Northern states after the Revolutionary War began to move towards abolition, whether immediate or delayed. By 1804, all northern states had abolished slavery. For their part, southern states moved even more forcefully to entrench the institution. This shift was further sparked by the invention of the cotton gin in 1793 by Eli Whitney. Whitney's invention separated the cotton seeds from the fiber, thus doing by machine work that would normally take many people to accomplish by hand. Further improvements in the machine in the next few decades led to an even more efficient process, eventually meaning that one cotton gin could do the work of 750 men. It could also separate the fiber from the seeds of short staple cotton, which is a denser cotton than long staple cotton and with more seeds. The short staple cotton plant, though, grows readily in regions all over the South, and thus the cotton industry spread rapidly in the early 1800s. This necessitated the use of vast numbers of slaves, however. Thus, as the North moved to abolish slavery, the South moved to make the institution even larger and harsher. The flexibility of the early years of slavery in America faded away. The Grapevine Express, temporary emancipation, and other expressions of independence and perhaps even equality became a thing of the past. Slaves in this period were also born in America. The slave trade from Africa was abolished in 1808. For all intents and purposes, though, the slave trade by that point was unnecessary. There were now more than enough slaves in the states to keep the institution going by reproduction. Children born to slave mothers became slaves, regardless of who the father was. So the pipeline that had continuously reinforced and refreshed the slaves' knowledge of and use of African customs dried up. African American culture, by necessity, grew less firmly rooted in African customs and became more Americanized as the generations went by. With that said, slaves continued to push for self-determination and to resist the atrocities of slavery. Secretly, some slaves managed to gain an education, occasionally aided by sympathetic whites. They continued the oral traditions of earlier generations. As even greater numbers now worked in the fields, they had more opportunity to talk to each other as they worked. telling stories, mocking the master, or even plotting rebellions. Through their music and dance, slaves might mock their masters in subtle ways. One form of dance that evolved into a fad was the cakewalk, which originated when slaves made an informal competition of impersonating the master's gait or walk. This practice evolved into exaggerated strutting and juking, and the slave owners actually enjoyed watching the slaves dance in this style, not recognizing that they were being mocked. The slave performing the best walk or dance was awarded a cake, hence the cakewalk. We will talk more about this trend later and return to other trends in the culture of African Americans as we move from slavery to freedom in the years of the Civil War and after. In our next lecture, we'll turn to a discussion of education, literacy, and early literature in the United States.